It was one of those afternoons where time stretched endlessly, the sun filtering through my window in golden patches, casting lazy shadows across my room. The faint hum of cicadas outside blended with the low buzz of my ceiling fan, the only sounds breaking the heavy silence. It was too warm, the kind of sticky heat that clung to your skin and made even the air feel thick. I had just stepped out of the shower, my body still damp, a towel slung loosely around my waist. The water had been cool against my heated skin, a relief from the summer's suffocating grasp. I ran my fingers through my wet hair, feeling the strands slip through my fingers, my mind still drifting somewhere between exhaustion and daydreams. It had been a long week. Work had drained me, and my social life, if you could even call it that, was nothing more than a handful of half-hearted text exchanges and ignored notifications. I had planned to spend the afternoon alone, just me and the comforting solitude of my room. Then my phone buzzed. "Frank, hey, I'm near your place. Thought I'd stop by." A sharp jolt ran through me, cutting through the fog of my relaxed state. Frank, my best friend, the one person who could both ground me and unravel me in the same breath. We had known each other for years. Since college, back when everything was simple, before I started questioning the feelings that lingered a little too long, the glances that held too much weight. He was straight, had a string of exes to prove it, and I had spent too much time convincing myself that whatever I felt for him was nothing more than admiration. I typed back quickly, fingers hesitating for a moment. Me, sure, doors unlocked. I hadn't meant to leave it open, but I rarely locked it when I was home. Besides, Frank never knocked. He always just walked in, throwing himself onto my couch, making himself at home in a way that was both irritating and endearing. A strange feeling settled in my stomach, a mixture of anticipation and something else, something I wasn't ready to name. I told myself it was nothing, just the usual nerves that came with seeing him. But as I stood there, still damp, still half exposed, with only a towel between me and the unexpected, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. And then I heard the door creak open. The door creaked open and my breath hitched. I turned just in time to see Frank stepping inside, his familiar frame backlit by the afternoon sun filtering through the hallway window. He was wearing his usual, an old gray t-shirt that stretched just a little too tightly across his chest, jeans that hung low on his hips, a baseball cap turned backward like he was still a college kid. His eyes landed on me, and for a brief second he froze. The air in the room shifted. "Shit," Frank muttered, immediately turning away, his hand flying up to shield his eyes like he had walked in on something forbidden. "Dude, what the hell? You couldn't throw some clothes on before inviting me over?" I swallowed hard, my skin suddenly prickling with heat that had nothing to do with the summer air. "You didn't knock," I said, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. "You said the door was open." There was a nervous edge to his laugh, one that made my stomach twist. He wasn't looking at me, not directly, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he lingered by the door like he was debating whether to leave or stay. It wasn't the first time Frank had seen me shirtless. We'd been friends for years, spent summers at the beach, crashed at each other's places more times than I could count. But this was different, maybe because we were alone. Maybe because there was nothing casual about the way his eyes had flickered over me before he turned away. I tightened the towel around my waist, trying to ignore the pulse of something unspoken between us. "Relax," I said, forcing a smirk. "It's just a body." Frank exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, put some damn clothes on before I lose my appetite." I should have let it go. Should have just grabbed some clothes and ended whatever strange tension had settled between us. But something about the way he said it, the forced nonchalance, the way his voice was just a little too tight, made me want to push. I stepped forward. Not much, just enough to close the space between us by an inch or two. "What's wrong, Frank?" Never seen a naked guy before. His jaw tensed. He glanced at me, quick and fleeting, then away again. "You're being weird." You're the one acting like this is a big deal. It's not. Then why are you still standing there? That did it, he scoffed, finally turning to face me fully, arms crossing over his chest in that defensive way he always did when he was uncomfortable. You're a pain in the ass, you know that? I grinned. You love me. Something flickered across his face. Too quick for me to catch, but I felt it. A shift, subtle but undeniable. It was in the way his eyes lingered just a second too long, in the way his fingers flexed against his arm like he didn't know what to do with them. And then, just as quickly as it had come, it was gone. Yeah, he muttered, rolling his eyes. Now get dressed before I start thinking you're trying to seduce me. He was joking. I knew that. But the words hung heavy between us, the air between us too thick, too charged. I hesitated for half a second. Then, without thinking, I let the towel slip just a little. Just enough. His eyes flickered down. It was instinctual, reflexive, like he hadn't meant to do it but couldn't help himself. The moment was over in a heartbeat, but I caught it. The hesitation, the tension, the way his throat bobbed as he swallowed. And suddenly, I wasn't sure if I was the one playing with fire or if I was the one about to get burned. I grabbed a pair of shorts from the bed and pulled them on, keeping my movements slow, deliberate, waiting for him to say something. He didn't. He just ran a hand through his hair, exhaling loudly, and finally moved toward the couch, dropping down onto it like the last 5 minutes hadn't happened. So, he said, his voice lighter now, forced casual, what's up? Thought you were busy this week. I watched him for a second, wondering if I should call him out on it, on whatever that had just been. But I didn't, because the truth was, I didn't want to scare him off. Instead, I sat down beside him, the space between us suddenly feeling like an invisible line neither of us was sure how to cross. Just been tired, I said. Work's been draining. Frank nodded. Yeah, same. Been meaning to hit you up sooner, but, life. It was such a simple word, but the weight behind it was anything but. Because life was the reason we never talked about the things we should. Life was the excuse we used to avoid conversations that could change everything. And yet, in that moment, with the air still thick between us, I wondered, was this one of those moments we pretend never happened? Or was it the beginning of something we couldn't ignore? I didn't know the answer, and something told me Frank didn't either. The air between us felt heavier than before, like something invisible was pressing down, thickening the silence. Frank had settled into the couch, but there was something about the way he sat, too rigid, too still. Normally, he sprawled out, completely at ease in my space. Now he sat forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his fingers idly rubbing together like he needed something to do with his hands. I stayed quiet, watching him, waiting. Outside, the sun had started to dip, casting long shadows across the room. The golden light slanted in through the blinds, striping his face with soft, broken lines. He wasn't looking at me, but I could feel it, that awareness, that tension coiling between us like a rubber band stretched too tight. I leaned back against the cushions, deliberately casual, testing the space between us. You okay? Frank let out a small, humorless laugh. Yeah, why wouldn't I be? I raised an eyebrow. You tell me. His jaw flexed. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply, before finally meeting my gaze. And there it was. Something raw in his expression, something I wasn't sure I'd ever seen before. He stopped himself, shaking his head like he was trying to clear a thought before it could form into words. Forget it, Frank. He tensed at the way I said his name. Not like a joke, not teasing, just waiting. I shifted slightly, closing the distance between us by just an inch, barely anything at all. But he noticed. His breath hitched, so quiet I almost missed it. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The only sound in the room was the distant hum of traffic outside, the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. And then in one slow, deliberate motion, Frank reached for the back of his neck, rubbing it in that nervous way he always did when he was unsure of something. "You ever think about—" He trailed off again, shaking his head like he was cursing himself. "Shit, never mind." I swallowed, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. "Think about what?" He hesitated. I could see the war in his eyes, the battle between whatever he wanted to say and whatever was stopping him from saying it. And then, almost too quiet to hear, "about us." The words hung between us like an exposed wire, buzzing with something dangerous, something we had never dared to touch. I stared at him, my throat dry. "Frank, forget it." He shook his head, already pulling back, like he was about to dismiss it, pretend it never left his mouth. I shouldn't have said. I moved before I could think. I reached for his wrist, stopping him, my fingers curling around the warmth of his skin. It was a mistake, or maybe it wasn't, but the second I touched him, something shifted. His gaze dropped to where my hand met his. His breathing changed, shallow, uneven. He didn't pull away, but he didn't move either. It was like we were both standing on the edge of something, toes curled over the precipice, neither of us willing to take the first step. I could feel the tension thrumming in him, in the way his fingers twitched under mine. I should have let go, but I didn't. I squeezed just slightly, my thumb brushing against the inside of his wrist, feeling the steady, erratic pulse beneath his skin. Frank inhaled sharply, and when he finally looked at me, there was no humor in his expression, no easy grin to hide behind. There was only this. Only us. I didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was both of us at the same time. But suddenly, we were closer, barely an inch between us, his breath warm against my skin, his hand hovering near my knee like he wanted to touch me but didn't know if he should. The moment stretched, dangerously fragile, a line we had never crossed before but were now towing so precariously. His eyes flickered to my mouth, just for a second, just long enough, and then a sharp knock at the door. We both jolted apart like we'd been burned. Frank practically leapt off the couch, his movements abrupt, his breath coming too fast. "Shit," he muttered under his breath, dragging a hand down his face. My heart was still pounding, my skin buzzing from where we had almost touched. I turned toward the door, still feeling the ghost of his presence beside me. The knock came again. Frank was already moving, already putting distance between us, his body language shifting back to something easier, something safer. As I stood up, I hesitated, glancing at him one last time. He wouldn't look at me. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders tense, his expression unreadable. And just like that, the moment was gone. I swallowed hard and turned toward the door. Whoever was on the other side had no idea what they had just interrupted, and I had no idea if we would ever get that moment back. I opened the door, my pulse still hammering in my ears. A delivery guy stood there, holding a package under one arm, looking vaguely impatient. Package for?" He glanced at the label. "Ethan?" "Yeah," I said, my voice rougher than I expected. I took the box from him, muttering a quick thanks before shutting the door again. When I turned back around, Frank was already across the room, standing near the window with his back to me. His shoulders were tense, hands still buried deep in his pockets. He hadn't moved since I answered the door, and something about that hit me harder than I wanted to admit. I set the package down on the counter, but neither of us spoke. The air between us had shifted, fractured, unsettled. The weight of what had almost happened still clung to the walls, thick and unspoken. I exhaled slowly. "Frank," he didn't turn around. I tried again, softer this time. "Say something." "I don't know what you want me to say." His voice was flat, but there was an edge to it, something tight and defensive. I took a hesitant step forward. "What happened just now?" "Nothing happened," he cut in sharply. He turned around then, finally facing me, his expression unreadable. "It was nothing." A sharp sting bloomed in my chest. "You don't believe that?" He let out a bitter laugh. I have to. The words hit harder than they should have. I clenched my jaw, searching his face, looking for something, anything, that told me he wasn't about to shove this down, bury it deep like it never existed. But he wouldn't meet my eyes. "So that's it?" I asked, my voice quieter now, more careful. "You're just gonna pretend?" He exhaled harshly, raking a hand through his hair. "Jesus, Ethan, I don't." He broke off, shaking his head. "I don't know what you want from me." "I don't want anything," I said. I stopped, because that wasn't true. I did want something. I wanted him to look at me the way he had just moments ago, when the space between us had been charged with something electric, something undeniable. I wanted him to admit that he had felt it, too. But Frank wasn't the type to say things out loud. He was the type to laugh things off, to bury uncomfortable truths under layers of sarcasm and denial. And right now, he was retreating, falling back into old habits, into the safety of pretending. My stomach twisted. "Do you regret it?" His jaw tensed. "There's nothing to regret." I flinched at that, not because I believed him, but because I could see how badly he wanted to. The silence between us stretched, taut and fragile. Finally, he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look, I gotta go." My chest tightened. "Frank, don't," he said quickly. Too quickly. He stepped back, already putting distance between us. His movements rushed like he needed to get out of here before I could say something that would make this real. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "So that's it." He hesitated for just a second, just long enough for me to see the crack in his resolve. But then he forced out a small, humorless chuckle. "It's not that deep, man." A hollow ache spread through me. I nodded slowly, feeling something inside me deflate. "Right. Got it." He hesitated again, like maybe, just maybe, he wanted to take it back. But then he exhaled sharply, grabbed his keys from the counter, and walked out without another word. The door clicked shut behind him, and I was left standing in the heavy silence, staring at the empty space where he had been, wondering if I had just lost something I never really had. The apartment felt different without him. I hadn't moved since Frank walked out, still standing near the counter, staring at the door like if I waited long enough, he'd come back. Like maybe he'd realize he had made a mistake and knock, breathless, eyes full of something he couldn't explain. But the silence stretched on, and deep down I knew he wasn't coming back. Not tonight. Maybe not for a while. I dragged a hand down my face, exhaling slowly. My chest still felt tight, like something inside me had been wound too hard and left that way. It wasn't just what had almost happened. It was everything after. The way Frank had looked at me. The way he had shut down, thrown up walls I wasn't sure I could break through. I glanced at my phone, half expecting a message from him. An excuse, maybe. Something to smooth over the jagged edges of the moment we had just lived in. Nothing. I let out a quiet laugh, one that held no real humor. What had I expected? That he'd suddenly stop running? That he'd turn around and admit the truth neither of us wanted to say out loud? I moved toward the couch and sat down heavily, my hands clasped in front of me, head dipping forward as I tried to steady the mess in my head. Would things ever go back to normal? Could they? I thought about texting him, but what would I even say? Come back? Let's talk? Are you really going to pretend this didn't happen? I knew him too well. He wouldn't answer. I glanced at the door again. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the moment everything changed between us. Not in the way I had hoped, but in the way that made people drift apart, that made something once unbreakable crack right down the middle. Or maybe this wasn't over. Maybe Frank wasn't just running away from me. Maybe he was running from himself. And if that was the case, the real question was, how long would it take for him to stop? And when he did, would I still be here waiting?